Hey, thank you. Wow. It's a pleasure to be back at Dallas again. In addition to my ties to some of the luminaries who populate your campus, my occasional writings in the area on the mess, I should say, that is Catholic higher education, often use Dallas as an example of how to do college education for college students the right way. While others are welcome to listen in, the intended audience for my presentation today is precisely Catholic students, especially in this instance, undergraduates. In other words, the young people. I know what you're thinking. Oh no, not one of those dreary talks by an old guy imparting wisdom to us benighted young people. Well, all I can say in my defense is that I hope it's not too dreary, and I hope you're not too benighted. In fact, I know you are not too benighted if you are in the process of obtaining a University of Dallas education. Still, you might be benighted enough to have complained mildly now and then, perhaps after a beer or two, about the Dallas core curriculum. Well, I'm here to quash your rebellious thoughts and murmurings. You don't know how lucky you are. Well, maybe some of you do. In the introduction to his book, Heretics, Chesterton argues strenuously for the primacy of philosophy and theory over so-called practicality and efficiency, and he ends with this striking scenario. Suppose that a great commotion arises in the street about something, let us say a gas lamppost, which many influential persons desire to pull down. A gray-clad monk, who is the spirit of the Middle Ages, is approached upon the matter and begins to say in the arid manner of the schoolmen, "Let us first of all consider, my brethren, the value of light. If light be in itself good," at this point, he is somewhat excusably knocked down. All the people make a rush for the lamppost. The lamppost is knocked down in 10 minutes, and they go about congratulating each other on their unmedieval practicality. But as things go on, they do not work out so easily. Some people have pulled the lamppost down because they wanted the electric light. Some because they wanted old iron. Some because they wanted darkness, because their deeds were evil. Some thought it not enough of a lamppost, some too much. Some acted because they wanted to smash municipal machinery. Some because they wanted to smash something. So gradually and inevitably, today, tomorrow, or the next day, there comes back the conviction that the monk was right after all, and that all depends on what is the philosophy of light. Only what we might have discussed under the gas lamp, we now must discuss in the dark. I was reminded of this passage during Notre Dame's recent curriculum review. In this case, the tearing down of the lamppost was the overthrow of St. Thomas and Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy in Catholic higher education and more generally in Catholic intellectual life throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s. As with Chesterton's scenario, there was insufficient theoretical reflection at the time, and different participants in the overthrow were motivated by very different reasons. What's more, the overthrow itself engendered literally thousands of little decisions over the years that completely altered the context within which any future discussion of the curriculum might take place. and altered especially the sort of people who would be having that discussion. As a result, and the recent curriculum review confirms this, there is no longer any hope of having at Notre Dame a coherent, well-informed, and fruitful discussion of what it would take to accomplish the goal of producing intellectually mature young Catholics. Even the goal itself is shrouded in darkness. And on this score, of course, Notre Dame is just a stand-in for almost every large Catholic university in the United States. I begin my presentation with the tale of this overthrow, not in order to dwell on its causes, but mainly in order to shed some light on the present and the short-term future. If you're interested in the causes, and there was blame enough on all sides to go around, I recommend Philip Gleason's work, especially his book, Contending with Modernity. Here, I'm more interested in the consequences. So there I was in the mid-1960s, a student in a diocesan seminary filled to the brim with aspiring clerics, studying philosophy and theology. In addition to various figures in the history of philosophy, we were reading the likes of Henri de Lubac, Karl Rahner, Bernard Lonergan, Edward Skillebeck, Yves Congar. I know for you guys this is, who are these people? And even the very early Joseph Ratzinger. Some of our teachers were just back from Rome, where they had drunk deeply of so-called transcendental Thomism, which upon later scrutiny I found to be in some significant ways an inversion of Thomism rather than a version of it. In any case, those were heady days. We who had hardly read a page of St. Thomas himself or of his most important commentators considered ourselves experts on the shortcomings of Thomism. When years later I read Ralph McInerney's vivid description near the beginning of Thomism in an Age of Renewal, of a mindless and baseless tirade by a young priest in a seminary common room against Thomism and prominent Thomists, I was embarrassed to recall that I myself had participated just as mindlessly and just as baselessly in many such conversations. And it wasn't merely us neophytes. Our elders, many of whom knew little of the actual documents of Vatican II, but had nonetheless imbibed what they called the spirit of Vatican II, decided that this spirit dictated the overthrow of Thomism and scholasticism in general on every front. Radical changes in undergraduate and graduate curricula at Catholic universities, colleges, and seminaries. Radical changes in faculty composition and interests at these same institutions. Radical changes in the composition and interests of graduate student populations, etc. And more particularly in the area of philosophy, after decades of inhabiting a philosophical ghetto, as they termed it, we were finally to come of age and to join the real philosophical world. Even though, truth be told, we did not have any very clear vision of what that meant, outside of banishing the Thomists, or of how to separate the wheat from the chaff in mainstream academic philosophy. The changes were, in retrospect, breathtaking. Let me give two examples from the institution I'm most familiar with. At Notre Dame, the standard 4-course requirement in Thomistic philosophy for undergraduates, course in philosophy of nature and philosophical anthropology, one in philosophy of knowledge, moral and political philosophy, metaphysics, devolved in the late 1960s into a 2-course university requirement in philosophy with literally no prescribed content for either the introductory course or the second level course. In addition, the so-called core curriculum in the humanities outside of philosophy became little more than a distribution requirement with no university-mandated content. As a result, it is today a common occurrence for a student to graduate from Notre Dame with literally no decent exposure at all to the thought of Aristotle or Plato, not to mention St. Augustine or St. Thomas. More tellingly, only a small percentage of our graduates has ever encountered in any depth the sane Thomistic understanding of the relationship between faith and reason or between faith and natural science. If before the overthrow, one of the accusations was that Notre Dame undergraduates were being indoctrinated with Thomism and Catholic philosophy, nowadays the typical Notre Dame graduate leaves campus without ever having heard that there is such a thing as Thomism or a Catholic philosophical tradition. And it is not just the undergraduates. In 2003, when the philosophy department was conducting a search for a Thomist, it turned out that some of my younger colleagues, cradle Catholics among them, had never even heard of a Thomist. One of them wondered, why would we want to hire someone who believes all and only what St. Thomas Aquinas believes? Now, obviously, she didn't really understand what being a Thomist meant, but it did occur to me to ask the question in my mind, I didn't say it out loud, well, we hired someone who believes all and only what you believe, which is worse. Again, the graduate program in philosophy, once predominantly Thomistic, was by the late 1960s being touted as pluralistic, which meant in practice that in the 45 years between 1968 and 2013, exactly 4 Thomistic-leaning philosophers were hired at Notre Dame, normally under the rubric medieval philosophy. And this despite the fact that the department doubled in size to 40 faculty members during that same period. Only 2 of the 4 are left on the faculty now. What's more, as noted above, the number of graduate students working on St. Thomas or on major scholastic figures has dwindled over the years. Actually, the number of Catholics. I think it's fair to say that I'm in a philosophy department that doesn't think of one of its major goals as serving the church by way of the intellectual life. Nowadays, we only have a handful of graduate students in either theology or philosophy, but especially philosophy, who are interested in St. Thomas or the other great scholastic thinkers. I could go on a little more about this. I mean, there's the fact that if you're ignorant of scholasticism, you're not going to be able to understand even the giants of the 20th century, who all embedded their problematics, what they were concerned about, within the context of scholasticism, even if they rebelled against it in various ways. It's hard to understand these people if you don't know anything about how they were trained or what they were trained in. Another point is that, as Gleason emphasized in his work on Catholic higher education, the rejection of Thomistic scholasticism and of the so-called Thomistic synthesis along with it was a major factor in the loss of vision that helped transform Catholic colleges and universities into what might appropriately be called public schools in Catholic neighborhoods. In short, when you combine the lack of an intellectual and moral compass with the aspiration to be great, even as Harvard and Princeton and Stanford are great, you could easily have anticipated what we now have, institutions that claim to be, quote, Catholic, but also intellectually excellent, where that very unThomistic but also tells you all you need to know about the lack of confidence Catholic university administrators have in their own distinctive intellectual traditions. This is no surprise given that nowadays many of these administrators are themselves the product of the sort of deficient Catholic education described above. Well, when we apply this last point to the particular case of philosophy as a profession, we come to the specific topic I want to concentrate on for the remainder of my paper. In particular, in the 60s and 70s, it was felt that, that's 1960s and 1970s, it was felt that Thomistic philosophy was out of touch with and could never be in touch with the best of contemporary philosophy as practiced at the best secular universities. The so-called ghettoization of Thomism was, to be sure, in some measure the fault of Thomists themselves, but it would be unfair to make this observation without noting that in the middle decades of the 20th century, mainstream analytic philosophy, mainstream Anglo-American philosophy, was dominated by logical positivism, pragmatism, and ordinary language philosophy, three of the most virulently anti-metaphysical movements in the history of philosophy. Despite the fact that none of these movements is dominant today, their effects have lingered for a very long time. So until recently, a certain amount of decorum and propriety and, as it were, indirection has been necessary on the part of Thomists and their sympathizers when they put forward Thomistic theses, as has in fact happened across a wide number of areas in mainline analytic philosophy over the past 25 or 30 years. Allow me a personal anecdote here. In 1997, a former student of mine, call him Gino, then a Rhodes Scholar doing a B.Phil at Oxford, everybody told him, why kill yourself doing a B.Phil? Just do grades. But Gino wanted to do a B.Phil. I think his starting class had 18 students in it, and it ended up with 7 or something like that. So he called me in desperation one afternoon. He had come across a problem of interpretation in the Nicomachean Ethics that had him completely baffled 3 days before he was scheduled to make a presentation on it to his tutor. I just found out a couple of months ago that tutor was Richard Sorabji, so that's interesting. My advice to him was to sneak into a library, furtively glance at a copy of St. Thomas's commentary on the Ethics for the relevant parts of it, and see if it might be of some help. He was, of course, not to mention St. Thomas to his tutor, or to anyone else for that matter. Well, to make a long story short, a week later I received another call from a now ebullient Gino. When he had laid out St. Thomas's interpretation of the problematic passages, without, of course, mentioning St. Thomas by name, the tutor stroked his chin, volunteered that he had never thought of the relevant text in that way, and pronounced the interpretation, quote, interesting, perhaps even brilliant. The moral of the story is that there was even at that time an openness to St. Thomas among some of the most hardened secular philosophers. You just had to be a bit subtle about it and very patient. Well, patience may still be in order, but as I will indicate in a moment, a lot less subtlety is required these days. For we seem finally to have reached the point in the narrative of English-speaking philosophy at which there's a new and increasingly explicit openness to Aristotelian Thomistic scholasticism. In other words, the stone that Catholic higher education rejected in the 1960s and 1970s in order to become relevant is itself becoming the cornerstone of a new movement within mainstream philosophy some 50 years later. To mark this delicious irony, which gets even more savory toward the end of the paper, I have entitled the last 2 sections, God Has a Sense of Humor, Part 1, and God Has a Sense of Humor, Part 2. Part 1 deals with some systematic matters, while Part 2 singles out 4 relatively recent books, 2 by younger Catholic philosophers and 2 by younger Catholic theologians, that exhibit what the short-term future of Thomism will look like at its best within Catholic thought and within the wider philosophical and theological culture. Now, God Has a Sense of Humor, Part 1, is a smidgen technical. I mean, I have this in here because I don't want you to think that I'm just making all of this up. On the other hand, we really don't need a lot of the detail that I go into in the paper. There's a version of this paper up on my website, and if you really want to look at it, if you want to see the details, you can see it there. But let me just give you, maybe summarize this. How are we doing here? Okay. I begin with a paper by James Ross from 1990. Jim Ross, if anybody who knew of him, Jim Ross used to write these kind of wacky but insightful papers, and this was one of them. It was called The Analyst's Fate, where the analysts are the analytic philosophers. The Analyst's Fate, Aristotle's Revenge. Actually, it had another colon after that, Software Everywhere, where by software, basically Jim Ross meant formal causes. Remember Aristotle's formal causes, the ones that went out in the 17th century and were replaced by a reductionistic philosophy of nature. Okay? Because formal causes are what make your dog and cat really real, and not just a collection of a bunch of corpuscles or atoms or quarks or strings or whatever. So what we have in the 17th century is a philosophy of matter which gives us matter which is capable of being aggregated, but we never get anything higher level than that. That is why Descartes had to banish inner lives from the world of matter. Okay, whenever I teach any course, just about, I always teach my students to associate no animal pain with the name Descartes. So I say Descartes, you say no animal pain. And the reason I do this is I want to make sure they understand just how implausible this is. Okay. Now that philosophy of nature, this is a little more complicated than I'm going to be able to explain at the moment, but that philosophy of nature, by and large, is what has dominated in the philosophical ruminations of philosophers since that time, and certainly dominated in Anglo-American analytic philosophy. Okay, so it's that kind of philosophy of nature. Reductionistic, explanation just from the bottom up, and we never run into higher level substances with higher level powers not reducible to the powers of the things that they're aggregated from, the little corpuscles. Actually, the science, in a way, doesn't make a whole lot of difference. This is really the same problem that Aristotle confronted in Physics 2 when he took on Empedocles and the atomists. That some people don't understand nature as form. They don't understand that it's an amazing fact about the world that, I'll put this in Aristotle's terms, you can have things that are potentially decomposable without material remainder into fire, air, earth, and water, which nonetheless have sensation, have feeling, seeing, they fear, They love, they hate, they thirst. These are our animal friends. Well, us too, but especially our animal friends. When Descartes came along, nope, that's too messy. It's not quantitative enough. We don't understand that. And so that picture went out the window. What Ross argues in his paper is that, as a matter of fact, the world which the natural sciences are actually delivering up to us is much more in keeping with Aristotle's philosophy of nature than with Descartes and the people who followed him, the reductionistic philosophy of nature. Okay. Now, Ross's paper is published in 1991, I think. It was about 25 years too early. But it did give some of us, anyway, some resolve. Because I remember reading it, and I wasn't a diehard Aristotelian at the time, but I just said, you know, this is exactly right. And I'm teaching Aristotle every year, and this is the most important thing in Aristotle. Physics 1 and Physics 2. Your mom is a real substance. And not just a collection of atoms or whatever, you know. And she has powers and operations that go way beyond anything that any atom could do. An interesting, you always have to be a little bit careful with books in popular science, because usually they're written by scientists who are grieving because their particular pet projects haven't been funded enough. But there is an interesting book by a Nobel winning physicist from Stanford by the name of Robert Laughlin. It's called A Different Universe. And Laughlin claims that even within the realm of physics itself, there is, as it were, there are higher level substances. When you move from the level of particle physics to the level of solid state physics, you are now dealing with new higher level entities, which have properties that can't be thought of as being reducible to the properties of their constituents, even within physics itself. So Ross's point was, look, philosophers, you guys are behind the times, and you're sweeping a lot of stuff under the rug here. And what the result of this is that your view not only of human beings, but of all other animals is skewed. You can't handle it. What happens in the philosophy of mind, in these discussions in philosophy of mind, in analytic philosophy, is the problem is defined in such a way that you have two choices. You can either be a materialist of some sort, or you can be a Cartesian dualist. See, what Descartes thought was, well, I got to find some place for the obvious fact that there's sensing and imagining and remembering and thinking out there and feeling. Well, Descartes said, here's the rational soul. It all goes there. So human beings are the only place in Descartes' universe where there's sensing and feeling and thinking, remembering, imagining. That's it. That's why your dog can't feel any pain. Your dog is just corpuscles. So is your body, but there's this other part of you, namely your soul, which is the place where all of this inner life resides. That's the only place where it is in the universe. So the problem gets defined, hey, what does St. Thomas for instance, think about the human being. Okay, let me just read a paragraph here. Give you a couple of paragraphs. According to the Thomistic view, the human soul, the intellective soul, is the subsistent and immaterial form of the human organism. It's not something separate from the human organism or something that the human organism is first constituted and then the soul comes to it in the manner of Descartes. It's the principle by which a certain matter is constituted as a particular sort of animal organism. Its peculiarly intellective operations do not directly involve sentient operations, but they nonetheless depend on sentience for their content and causal origins. So on this view, human beings are unified animal organisms, but also distinctive within the animal kingdom because of their higher intellective powers and operations. And it is precisely these intellective powers and operations that entail the subsistence and immateriality of the form that makes these corporeal organisms to be what they are. Sentience, on the other hand, does not by itself entail either the subsistence or immateriality of the forms of lower animals. So on this view, sentient cognition, seeing, hearing, etc., and feeling, ouch, do not by themselves require an immaterial subject. It's just an amazing fact about the world, as I said before, that certain corporeal substances, non-rational animals, are potentially decomposable without remainder into their elemental constituents, and yet they're nonetheless conscious beings capable of sensing and remembering and imagining and feeling. Now, all of this makes perfectly good sense and comports well with our ordinary ways of thinking about ourselves and about other animals, but it entails a conception of the potentialities of matter that does not fit the 17th century model. But the contemporary problematic, the way in which the so-called mind-body problem gets solved, gets set up, forces you, well, it basically doesn't leave any room at the inn for a view like the one I just described. The view that sounds like, hey, yeah, that's what I think about me and my dog. Oh, okay. Rather, you're forced into some form of materialism. Now, the most honest form of materialism is the one that just says, yeah, Descartes was right. Material beings have no inner life at all. Too bad for dogs. And oh, by the way, since Descartes was wrong about the soul, too bad for you. Actually, Alex Rosenberg ends his book defending this kind of view by saying, if that bothers you or you find it depressing, take Prozac. Oh, and if you're still depressed, take more Prozac. And Alex Rosenberg is a serious philosopher. Now, I'm serious about that. He's a serious philosopher. So there are these so-called eliminative materialists who say, yeah, this whole idea we have of ourselves, the way we conceive of ourselves, not just our dogs, but ourselves, is just completely mistaken. Someday, our view of ourselves will need to be replaced by a better neurophysiology. Because what we have is a sort of proto-scientific theory, you know, the one that says, oh, I see things, oh, I feel a cool breeze, oh, I'm in love. Yeah, okay. We need to translate all of that. Now, most materialists won't go that far, but they do have this fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem is what to do with all this inner life, which doesn't, according to them, have anything to do with science. These things don't explain anything. They're not neuronal firings or whatever. They're not quantifiable. Right? What do we do with them? Well, the rest of the materialists, the ones who don't deny that we have an inner life or that animals have an inner life, try to neutralize the inner life. tried to show that it's causally irrelevant, and that's why it doesn't show up in scientific explanations or theories. Actually, inner lives do show up in, well, okay, never mind. See, that's Ross's point. Ross keeps saying, but wait a minute, have you guys been reading? Okay. Have you been reading the science? But, so you either you're forced to choose between that or the kind of dualism that Descartes had, right? And if you're a Thomist, you just say, no, there's something wrong with the way in which this problem has been set up. And you know something? The philosophers themselves are beginning to notice that there's a problem with the way it's set up. Just a few years ago, Thomas Nagel, one of the best analytic philosophers out there, a card-carrying member of the elite analytical philosophers, published a book called Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. And his point is precisely the one I've been making, and especially about animals. There is no, our contemporary philosophical theories, I mean, he doesn't even take dualism seriously, so our contemporary philosophical forms of materialism simply cannot accommodate the inner life of animals. There's no room for them. And that's just bad. If you make me choose between believing that my dog feels pain, and what? Now, I'm not saying, and here are the Thomists saying, hey, we have this alternative. Now, Nagel himself does not espouse Aristotelianism, although he comes close to, giving a rendition of it. I mean, there are other possibilities in the history of philosophy. In fact, one of my heroes of the 17th century, Leibniz, already had one of them, right? Hey, on Descartes' view, the little things don't have any inner life, so aggregations of them don't have any inner life. Well, Leibniz said, why don't we give the little things an inner life? Now, these monads are not exactly smart. They're kind of dull, but they have cognition, right? And Nagel, here we are in the 21st century, actually toys with this as a possibility. I mean, he brings it forward. He says, look, panpsychism is one way to go here. And it seems a lot more true to what we know about the world than what we now have. Okay. An Aristotelian would say, okay, look, maybe we just have to accept it as a brute fact that nature organizes itself in such a way that some material things, voila, have inner lives. Okay? There are tough choices to make, but those are the choices. At least the Thomistic view kind of gets on the table with the other stuff. It becomes part of the conversation. That's something that didn't happen before. I'll give you one more example of how this can work. I've spent a lot of my time working on causality and agency. Now, all of you people know about Aristotle's conception of efficient causality. Agents make things happen. But from Aristotle's perspective, human agency is just a higher order manifestation of something that's going on in all of nature. You have powerful particulars, as some philosophers have called substances, at all levels of nature, just poised to act under the appropriate circumstances. And they bring about effects. And that's basically how we should understand causality. Now, there are naysayers here. You know, I say, hey, I turned the gas flame on under the pot of water, and a little bit later, the water was boiling. I saw the gas flame make the water boil. Not so fast, says the naysayer. And the naysayer there are lots of naysayers with Muslim names, beginning back in medieval Muslim philosophy with great philosophers like Al-Ghazali. Okay, not so fast. More famously, in modern times, the naysayers are people like David Hume, right? You see the flame, you see the pot, you see the water, you make the measurements, and at different times the temperature gets higher and higher, but what you don't do is to see the fire make the water hot. Now, this is a very noble philosophical disagreement. It's kind of between the people who are kind of pessimistic about our cognitive faculties and their reliability, and other people who are a little more upbeat. It's Aristotle versus Hume, right? And, so you get to draw your swords and have a real philosophical battle. But what happens in the analytic discussion of causality? Well, among the metaphysicians anyway, you only get two choices, and Aristotle ain't one of them. If you want to give an account of causality, you have to choose between the so-called regularity theory of causality, where things constantly conjoin, blah, 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 okay, and the so-called counterfactual dependency theory of causality. Those are your only two choices. Now, for a long time in the literature, probably 15 or 20 years, these two theories were battling against one another, and in the end, neither one emerged victorious. No matter what little wrinkles and epicycles they put into their accounts, and of course the accounts got more and more complicated, there were always devastating counterexamples. Analytic philosophers are wonderfully clever. We can come up with counterexamples. But of course, from an Aristotelian perspective, wait a minute, you guys, didn't you leave something out? You're not talking about agency. You're talking about indications of agency or something like that, right? Agency, real efficient causality, has to do with making things happen. It's built right into our language, says Miss Anscombe. So once again, we had this, your standard medieval philosophy would say that regularity and counterfactual dependence are signs, defeasible signs. They don't always work, but defeasible signs of genuine agency. But it's genuine agency which is causality. Okay. So you see how problematics, how the way in which problems are set up can exclude certain possible solutions or accounts a priori. And that happened a lot in analytic philosophy vis-a-vis Aristotelian and Thomistic positions. It happened in moral theory as well. That's another story. Alistair MacIntyre and Elizabeth Anscombe especially play a large role in that, in kind of reconfiguring the problematic. But a lot of that has gone on, and, it may not be a groundswell. It isn't as though everybody is taking up arms and saying, oh yes, now Aristotle returns, Aristotle's revenge. But enough people are, and enough honest philosophers realize that there are difficult problems built into the present discussions that aren't easily solved. And where are they turning for possible solutions? To Aristotle and St. Thomas, many times. Okay? I'm not saying they would win the next election, but I am saying they're real players on the stage now. A little, 50 years later, And you don't have to do this undercover anymore, which is the great thing. God has a sense of humor, part 2. St. Luke tells us that in reprimanding the crowds who flocked to him as a prophet, John the Baptist uttered these memorable words: "Do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our ancestor,' for I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham." Even given the philosophical and theological devastation to Catholic higher education, wrought in large measure by the overthrow of Thomism, a trickle of Thomists has continued to emerge in the intervening years. However, perhaps in order to make a point, God has of late been raising up exceptional Thomists from the very stones, as it were. I will briefly mention 4 relatively recent books, 2 by younger theologians and 2 by younger philosophers, which exhibit Thomism at its intellectual best in the world of contemporary philosophy and theology. It's worth noting that not one of the authors is in possession of either a faculty position or so much as a degree from any of the establishment Catholic universities that jettisoned Thomism in the 1960s and 1970s. The 2 philosophers are former atheists. One of the theologians is a convert from Judaism, and the other is a convert from what we might call Jewish Presbyterianism. Well, his father is Jewish, his mother is Presbyterian. He grew up in Georgia. He went to Brown. He read Foucault. He became Catholic and is now a Dominican priest. It's my good buddy, Father Thomas Joseph White, or Father TJ as we call him. I'll begin with the philosophers. As I've already noted, I noted in the written version, Aristotelian and Thomistic incursions into contemporary mainstream metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and moral theory have tended to be piecemeal and fragmentary. And this very spottiness itself sometimes distorts both the intentions and the teachings of St. Thomas and other scholastic authors. The 2 books I'm about to mention reject this piecemeal approach, and in open dialogue with mainstream analytic philosophers, they go for the jugular. They argue unabashedly and very effectively for a full-scale and systematic adoption of Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics as a cure for what ails contemporary analytic metaphysics and philosophy of mind. The first book is David Oderberg's Real Essentialism. I love that title. When I teach the pre-Socratics, we always talk about, and he thought that air was the really real. Okay, Real Essentialism, which contains a brilliant and now, when I talk about these books and I say these amazing, give them these amazing compliments, it doesn't mean that I agree with everything in them, but close enough. Which contains a brilliant and extended defense of undiluted Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics, along with a critique of a wide array of alternative positions on various metaphysical issues proposed in the current literature on analytic metaphysics. I'll give the short version of these books here. Next, I turn to Edward Feser's Scholastic Metaphysics, a Contemporary Introduction, which has been, I know you're not going to believe this, but which has been a philosophical bestseller on Amazon.com since it was published in 2014. I know something about Amazon.com numbers. One of my kids once had a bestseller. Hey, ooh, cool. But I know what philosophy numbers look like too. And I could not believe, I swear, I could not believe the numbers for this book. I mean, at one point, it was under 1,000. For a philosophy book, unless you're Alistair McIntyre, you don't do this sort of thing. And the name of the book is Scholastic Metaphysics. Explain that. It was unbelievable. Feser covers some of the same ground as Oderberg, but spends more time on causality. Okay, that's fine. You don't need to know that right now. One thing I really like about Feser's book is that not only does he do it in dialogue with contemporary philosophers from the big-time universities, he also engages and draws upon the very same 20th century Thomistic textbooks, not the manuals now, but the good textbooks that the repudiators of Thomism in the 1960s thought of as an embarrassment. I mean, we're talking about people, this is exhilarating for me, Henry Corin, George Klubertans, Charles Hart, and of course, Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange are drawn into conversation with analytic philosophers such as Anthony Kenny, David Armstrong, and David Lewis. And Feser has done a lot of terrific work on the arguments for God's existence in St. Thomas, and he's got this great blog. He's probably done as much as anyone in the last 10 years to promote and defend Thomism within mainstream philosophical circles. I'm going to skip one joke. Sorry. Need to get to the end here. The third book I want to mention is a theology book. Well, it's a kind of combination, really. Wisdom in the Face of Modernity, a study in Thomistic natural theology, because it's a book about natural theology, and this is by Father Thomas Joseph White. This guy is an up-and-comer, and he can play the banjo. This is a very ambitious book in which Father Thomas Joseph attempts to clarify just what the project of Thomistic natural theology is and how that project is immune to the objections of Kant and Heidegger against so-called ontotheology. Now, if you're into theology and you've heard this kind of talk before, then you need to read this book before you go saying, oh, St. Thomas, ontotheology, bad. Reject it. Read this book. Okay. Actually, well, no. Okay. No, I'm not going there. The last book I want to mention, and this is another great story, is Lawrence Feingold's The Natural Desire to See God According to St. Thomas and His Interpreters. Feingold is a great story. He and his wife are Jewish. He goes to Florence, I think. I may get some of the details wrong here. He goes to Florence. He falls in love with Catholic culture and art. He and his wife convert to Catholicism. He's a sculptor. And he goes and gets a PhD in theology at the University of the Holy Cross in Rome, one of the pontifical universities, Santa Croce. And his dissertation is this incredible book, which, well, let me just describe it here, which brings a wealth of historical depth and especially analytical acumen to bear upon one of the most heated intellectual debates of mid-20th century Catholic theology, namely the debate over Henri de Lubac's cluster of positions on nature and grace. Don't get me wrong here, I sympathize with de Lubac's motivations and certain key elements of his approach, but de Lubac was a patristic scholar, and his books often have, in addition to some very creative and interesting ideas, a lot of conceptual sloppiness. And Feingold, really, this book is just, if you're going to work on an intricate theological topic, be prepared to be clear and to distinguish clearly and to write clearly. The culture of theology has gone too far in the other direction. Recent popes accepted. If you read Joseph Ratzinger, you find a philosophical mind at work. Someone who knows a good argument when he sees one and a bad argument when he sees one. Someone who can make the right distinctions at the right times. That's what we need more of. And Feingold's book is a masterpiece of that, and really shows scholasticism at its best and how powerful it can be when it's done correctly and within the right sort of context. Okay. Hey, I know. Philosophy can get on your nerves sometimes when you're asked to be picky in a vacuum, as it were. And that's why it's always important for philosophers and theologians to keep the bigger contexts in mind. Otherwise, you lose sight of what you're aiming for in the end, and you can get distracted. Sometimes just because you need to show off. I mean, if you go and read Plato's dialogues again, and many of the early dialogues are written, I'm convinced, just to show us the many ways in which philosophical inquiry can fail because of flaws in the people having the conversation, intellectual flaws, moral flaws, affective flaws of various sorts, then that will be a good inoculation against the kind of sort of mindless attention to detail that can destroy good philosophy. But not every instance of attention to detail is a distortion. Sometimes it's absolutely necessary. Okay, and that's why I think Feingold's book is great. Okay, and finally, look, it wasn't my intent to engage in now useless recriminations about the 20th century overthrow of Thomism in Catholic higher education and intellectual life. However, I have noted some of the intellectual desolation that has resulted, especially for the last several generations of Catholic college students. There are many fervent and smart young Catholics out there who aren't interested in refighting the old battles of pre- and post-Vatican conciliar Catholicism. More than anything else, these young people want and need light to illumine their way in a very difficult world. Pope after Pope has advised us to go to St. Thomas for this light. Perhaps it's time that we started paying attention to them again. The fact is that, love him or hate him, St. Thomas provides contemporary Catholic philosophers and theologians, even those who choose in the end to deviate from him in one way or another, with the philosophically most plausible starting points in philosophy of nature, natural theology, metaphysics, moral theory, and philosophical anthropology, along with the deepest and most thoroughly worked out account of the relation between faith and reason. At least start there. At least if you start there, you may have, if not the agreement, at least the grudging respect of academically serious people. Now, of course, given the state of college campuses these days, we wonder whether there are any such people left on college campuses, but there are. There are honest inquirers after the truth. And it looks like, at least at this point in our history, St. Thomas gives you the possibility of getting your foot in the door anyway. Grudging respect is okay. It's true that people can hate you and respect you at the same time, but as I recall from the Gospels, that comes with the territory. Pope Francis wants the Church to serve as a field hospital on the battleground of modern life. Well, that field hospital has an intellectual wing among others. And there are many spiritual works of mercy that need tending to by Catholic philosophers and theologians. Thomism has much to offer on this score, or so at least I have argued. Thank you.